Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Carolyn Merrick, Program Coordinator here at the Center, and delighted to have this presentation today about wildlife corridors, excuse me. And I'll first introduce our first speaker is Misty Boos. She's the Executive Director of Wild Virginia. She will then she will do a presentation and introduce Bridget Donaldson, who is also a very large part of this endeavor to keep wildlife and us safe. They're here to share exciting updates in wildlife crash reduction research and Virginia policy and planning to help identify and protect wildlife corridors, boy, that word is not working for me today, to help reduce collisions. They'll also explain what's being done through the work of Virginia Wildlife Corridors Collaborative to help wildlife move safely across our state and again, to keep us safe as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to um, Misty Boos.
Thank you. We're so excited to be here. So first of all, I just want to kind of tee up what we're going to be talking about today. So our presentation today is really all about helping both people and wildlife get where they need to go safely. And Bridget's actually going to start today by giving us a description of what habitat fragmentation is and a little bit about how roads play into that. She's going to talk a little bit about deer crashes in Virginia and show you some examples of what wildlife crossings look like. And then she's going to dig in a little bit deeper to her research on I-64 and her fencing study. And then at the very end, she'll explain a bit about what VDOT can do and consider to make wildlife crash reductions. After that, I'll be covering more about what's being done here in Virginia to try to reduce habitat fragmentation, and I'll be talking about the ways you can get involved to help. So before any further talk from me, let me now introduce my colleague, Bridget. Bridget Donaldson is an Associate Principal Research Scientist for the Virginia Transportation Research Council. And if you don't know, that's the research division of the Virginia DOT. And she's been in her position for 17 years after receiving her MS in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Tennessee. She conducts a wide range of research projects, including measures to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, assessing the water quality effects of road projects, and improving the resiliency of VDOT's infrastructure to the effects of climate change. So take it away, Bridget.
Great. Thank you, Misty. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. I'm excited to be with you guys today. It's a really good wet day for a Zoom presentation, so I'm happy to be doing this. All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, as Misty mentioned, I'm with the Virginia Department of Transportation. So I'm an environmental research scientist. We have a separate research building actually on UVA grounds. And a lot of our scientists are also UVA professors. So just a little background on fragmentation that you may all be aware of is that roads are a big contributor to fragmentation. So basically chopping up nice quality wooded habitat into smaller pieces. And as you can see in this illustration, let's see, do you all see what I'm seeing with the, there we go, that's a little bit better. Okay, sorry, you might not see what I'm seeing, but I'm moving things around. So on the left here is a nice high quality habitat with a lot of interior forest. Once you fragment that, whether it's from housing development or roads, you're really decreasing the amount of that interior forest and the species that depend on that higher quality habitat. And you're increasing that, that edge amount. So the edges of woods are often more generalist species like deer and things that you often see as roadkill, unfortunately. So fragmentation, as you know, is a huge problem in our country and certainly in Virginia in terms of just reducing that high quality forested habitat. We still do have a lot of it in the state, so we have a lot of opportunities to preserve it. But roads can cause, in terms of wildlife, direct mortality, of course. Well, first of all, you're chopping down the habitat. Once the road's there, there's the issue of striking a vehicle or striking an animal with your vehicle. And for the species that don't even want to cross a road, roads can be a barrier for those populations. And so it can isolate populations by not allowing species to travel to access their mates. And that really reduces the genetic diversity in those populations, which can then make them more vulnerable to kind of small extinction events of those populations. And here is our county with Charlottesville right in the middle. So this is just kind of a visual of what it looks like from a satellite view. And you can see that there are highly fragmented areas, so chopped up habitat, but we do have a lot, especially along the ridge lines here, the mountains here, we do have a lot of contiguous forest. And this is kind of a closer up view showing the roads. Now these are only primary roads and interstates. Here's 29 going here. We have I-64 kind of along the bottom, you can't quite see. And this isn't even showing all the roads. Within each of these little sections, there's tons of roads. So you can see the road effect to the fragmentation is quite large. And you can also see how it would be possible for VDOT or other organizations to identify those habitat corridors across the roads, so we can then look at areas we need to focus on to try to connect that habitat, create habitat connections for wildlife. So for VDOT in particular, we are very concerned with deer vehicle collisions because of the driver safety aspect. And we're one of the top 10 states in terms of the highest number of deer crashes in the US, with about 60,000 per year. So in a lot of areas, deer crashes are the highest crash type. And when I speak about deer vehicle collisions in terms of things we can do to mitigate, I also am kind of addressing on the side all these other species that are also affected by roads. So usually the countermeasures that work for deer to mitigate deer crashes also work for other species of wildlife. So even though I'm with VDOT and I'm kind of biased towards the driver safety aspect, what I am talking about will benefit other species of wildlife. So what we know in the US are that these wildlife crossing structures are really the best way to both reduce wildlife crashes and allow wildlife to access that habitat across the road. So that's allowing that habitat connection and increasing that ability for them to move to access resources and mates and whatever else. So these structures can come in all shapes and sizes. A lot of them weren't even designed for wildlife, but might be just bridges over a river that also have room for wildlife to move under them. They can be small culverts that allow, these are badgers on the right or turtles on the bottom, and even fish passage. So you can have all kinds of these underpasses that work for different species, you know, whether or not they were designed for wildlife in mind. And then we've got the most beautiful structures here. These are overpasses. We now have a handful of these in the US, mostly out west where they're dealing with elk and migratory animals that move in big herds. These two photos are from Canada, actually. And you can see it's just this seamless transition of habitat right over the roadway. And these cost millions of dollars too, of course. So now I'm talking a little bit about the research project we did here in Albemarle County and extending a little bit west into Afton Mountain on I-64. So we knew on I-64 that deer crashes were a huge problem, actually the most common type of crash in this area. And especially right now, if you're driving around, it's a huge time of year for hitting deer, unfortunately. So we knew that we have thousands of underpass structures in the state that have the potential to be used by wildlife. We only have 2 really that were designed for wildlife, but there's so many other opportunities that we could take advantage of by increasing the use of these structures for wildlife. So how do we do that? So we identified a couple structures on I-64 in these deer crash problem areas. And we thought about, okay, what makes it more successful for wildlife to use these structures? And we know that when wildlife crossings are designed, they're always designed with fencing. And you can see this fencing helps funnel the animal towards the structure. And it also goes along the road and physically keeps animals from entering the roadway. So it functions to both decrease crashes and increase the use of that structure. So we found a couple of structures that looked large enough for larger animals like deer and black bears to use beneath I-64. And we asked, would the addition of fencing increase the use of these structures and decrease crashes? And so these structures are about 5 miles apart. The site 1 is actually by the Ivy exit in Charlottesville. And then site 2 is the Meekums River. That's the bridge over the Meekums River. And that's another view of it. And you can see, speaking of kind of habitat corridors, you can see that these structures kind of lie right where there's already a corridor, and the road is kind of breaking up that nice habitat corridor for wildlife. And so what we were envisioning is adding fencing. You can see in the red, that's the fencing that we were envisioning. It would be about 1 mile and have the ends of the fencing kind of angle away from the road. Ideally, you can end the fence like along a steep hill or something that makes it difficult for wildlife to just get around and walk onto the roadway. But first we needed to justify the cost of fencing. So fencing really is only a couple $100,000 to do a mile on both sides of the interstate. So it's relatively cheap, but we still wanted to make sure, is fencing even needed? So maybe wildlife are using the underpasses already and really not traveling along the road or crossing the road right where those underpasses were. So we wanted to see what they were doing right there along the roadside and in the underpasses. So we put up lots and lots of these cameras that automatically detect wildlife movement and take a photo of it. So we had these cameras spaced every 1/10 of a mile for a full 1 mile stretch with these underpasses right in the center of that 1 mile. And we chose a mile because we didn't want the fencing to go on and on and on. Otherwise, it would really create a barrier for species. We wanted every animal that uses this area to be able to access the underpass. And then we put the cameras in the wildlife underpasses themselves, so we could count the number of animals, the species of animals, the time of year they use it the most, and things like that. So you can see this is a really tunnel-like dark culvert. Deer are not a huge fan, but they did use it before fencing. We had a few hundred crossings per year by deer before fencing. This is a coyote on the bottom right. There are a lot of coyotes. Here's a fox on the top left. We also have bobcats. If you can see that little bobcat right here, they're beautiful. I've never seen one in person, just through the camera. And here's the bridge. So this is that bridge over the Meekum River. And this was used a lot more by wildlife because it's just this open space. It's not dark. They can see any potential predators. And black bears use this one a lot. So black bears did not use the box culvert before fencing, but they did use this bridge underpass. And then the cameras along the roadside, we also documented that animal behavior. So mostly what deer do is they eat grass and that vegetation right on the edge there. The other thing they do about 50% of the time is just walk along it and glance at the interstate, presumably looking for a place to cross. So they really do use that roadside as habitat. And there was a relationship between the amount they used the roadside just for feeding and moving and deer crashes. So obviously the more deer that are on the side of the road, the more often they do get hit. And this is other wildlife loads. Every mammal you can think of was on camera, even this turkey on the top left. This is my favorite picture of a mama bear and her 3 cubs. That was up near the Meekums Bridge site. And so unlike deer, black bear really don't use that roadside for habitat. They just want to be able to cross. They come up through the woods, look for a place to cross, and then hopefully successfully do. This is a coyote on the bottom. We've got a groundhog on the bottom left and a fox on the bottom right. And then don't worry about reading this graph, but this is kind of how I documented the use of the underpasses, which is represented by these green bars, compared to the activity by deer along the roadside. So the overall finding here was there was high wildlife activity on the roadside next to these underpasses. Even though the underpasses were used a lot of animals just said, I'd rather just cross the road here than go through the underpass. And in terms of deer crashes, in these 1 mile segments, every year, there would be 8 to 10 deer crashes per mile. So 1 mile, you can count on at least 8 deer crashes per year. And so it's a very high number. So this justified us saying, okay, we're going to construct fencing. And so we did. So we got 8-foot high fencing. That's the height that we know that deer are not going to jump over. We have these jump out structures on the bottom right that allows any animals that are on the road side of the fence, if they do happen to get in there, they can escape, but they can't jump from the wood side onto the roadside. So we constructed 1 mile of fence at both of these sites a couple years ago. And we did the same type of studies so we could directly compare before fencing to after fencing. And here's the camera circled in red right here. So you can kind of see how we did the monitoring. And we documented, how many animals were on the good side of the fence versus the bad side of the fence, and also how many used the underpass. So this project was crazy successful. It was wonderful. We had a 92% deer crash reduction. So here on the left are the years before fencing was constructed. So for instance, there were 9 and 10 deer crashes in that 1 mile segment at those sites per year before fencing, 15 1 year, 10. Once we had fencing construction here, it went down to 0 at one site and 1 deer crash at another site for the first year and 2 and 0 for the second year. So a huge reduction. We were really happy about that. It turns out that they didn't just go around the ends of the fence, that when they learned where that underpass was, that was a preferred means of crossing the road. They would rather use that than try to find the end of the fence. So the use of the underpasses was also exciting. We had a huge increase. So in that box culvert that deer weren't so sure about and that black bears never used, we had a 410% increase by deer. So I think close to 1,000 deer per year are using that structure, an 81% increase by other wildlife. Black bears are now using it, like I said. And then the bridge underpass also had a huge increase, even though it was already popular by wildlife. Now that they know that they either go through the underpass or they can't access the habitat, they will happily go through the underpass. So those numbers made us very happy. And these are some fun videos. It might be a little choppy, but we had a video camera there just for fun. And every species that we documented at some point brought their young through the underpasses. So they're not only using these structures more, but they're teaching their young to use them and how to find them. Here is a fox. There's a lot of fox that come through here. And the next one is, this is a real short one, but it's beautiful bobcat. Just sniffing around. I might play that one again because it's so short. That's my favorite. Oh, it's not gonna let me maybe. Okay, well, anyway. And then we have this big guy coming through. Like I said, before fencing, black bears would approach this underpass, but never cross through it for whatever reason. It was probably too small. After fencing, we're now getting several crossings per year. And that number will probably increase as more bears learn where the structure is. So in terms of cost savings, it's really a huge win situation for drivers. Property damage costs from 1 deer crash can be several $1,000s. So when you're talking about the numbers that we're reducing and comparing that to the fencing cost, we have a over $2 million savings over the lifetime of that fence when we're looking at property damage crash reduction. So to make up for the cost of the fence, you would only need 1 deer crash reduction per site. We had 8.5 deer crash reductions per site per year. So it's well worth the effort. And this really convinced VDOT to do more, like, let's do more of this. So how are we going to do that? We're now creating wildlife crash reduction guidelines for VDOT, so we can help them determine where to put these kinds of things. And it's not just fencing and underpasses, but there's a couple other methods that we found successful for reducing wildlife crashes. And then we're also doing a different method of collecting wildlife crash data. Right now we rely on police reports, and most people don't really report their deer crashes to the police. So we're going to look at other ways of getting really good information and data on where these crashes are occurring. So this research has opened up a lot for us in terms of what we can do in VDOT to create those habitat connections for wildlife. And that is all I have. So Misty, you can take it away from here.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Bridget. All right, do you guys see the big bear?
Yes.
All right. So proud of my Zoom skills. It's a lot to learn these days, isn't there? All right. Well, Bridget always inspires me, and she definitely has motivated my interest in this work. So I'm so glad she was here today to present with me. And I'm just going to take us up, a whole bunch of feet and think about the big picture just for a second. And I want to talk to you a little bit about why I'm so inspired by this work and what really gets me excited. So first of all, when we're thinking about habitat connectivity, it's taken on its own. So quite simply, habitat connectivity is a really big deal. We're basically doing nothing short of maintaining the entire circulatory system of our planet when we help species move safely. And I think that's really important to remember. And I'm hoping this video will play for you. And some of you may have seen it, but I could watch it all day because it shows the average direction that mammals, birds, and amphibians move as they shift across the landscape. And of course, this changes seasonally. And it's beautiful and was put together by researchers from the University of Washington and the Nature Conservancy. And what they were trying to do was model the potential habitat for almost 3,000 species using climate change projections and the needs of all these species. And what this basically shows is that every road and every development interrupts this flow and this circulatory system of our planet. And as we continue to build out and use up the land for our own purposes, we have to remember that all the species that need to move safely, and these are the systems that support us, and these are the systems we need to survive as well. So thinking about wildlife movement corridors is a really critical way of imagining and understanding the landscape. And I think it's something we can all understand, especially with the aid of wonderful tools like this. So as much as I'd like to keep watching this, I'm going to turn it off. And then, so knowing that there's, some major concerns, there's habitat fragmentation, there are things getting in the way of that flow. What do we do about it? So a few years ago, I helped to form this group called the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative. That's a long name. We call it VSWC for short, just to save ourselves. But the goal is really simple. It's to help people and wildlife get where they need to go safely. And so this group's made up of nonprofits like mine, agencies, universities, and individuals like you who care about improving habitat connectivity, reducing wildlife mortality on our roadways, and helping wildlife get where they need to go. And here's just a few of our partners. We've been meeting every few months for years now to think about what projects we might undertake to really start to make a difference on the ground here in Virginia. So, Bridget's talked about this a little, so I'll go through this quickly, but, so what might a group like ours do to reduce animal vehicle collisions? What might be some first actions we might take? Well, a great first example is one of our partners is William and Mary University, and one of their students has been helping us to identify and map crash hotspots for deer. And the student's helping us identify where most deer are being hit on the roads, and this can help us focus our attention on the high crash areas. If you are interested in learning more, I've created a link here to a story map. And if you've never explored a story map, they're really fun. And it gives you a good overview of the project, talks about their methodology and how they arrived at their conclusions. Knowing, of course, as Bridget mentioned, the data is not great out there. And I'll talk about that later. And now the collaborative is working with folks from the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. And we're trying to build on this work and create tools that land managers can use to make good planning decisions for wildlife all across the state. So, once we've identified crash hotspots, what do we do, right? What do you put in place? So Bridget showed us some of this already, but, on the left is the amazing gold standard big wildlife crossings that you see in Canada and, out west. But we can also retrofit existing culverts, modify them to serve as better wildlife crossings. We can make them wider, improve the substrate that wildlife need to walk on to make it more appealing. We can make them quieter or brighter. We can fence around them, like what Bridget mentioned, so that wildlife have no choice but to use them rather than crossing the road. So there's a lot of thrifty, accessible projects, just like the one on the right, that are available right now. And as Bridget showed us, even modest interventions can make a really big difference. So our Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative doesn't want to be a group that just sits around and talks. You know, we're really motivated and want to get change on the ground and get things going. So we're looking a lot at, you know, what are the low-hanging fruit? What are the things we can do now with an eye to the future and that big scale vision? You know, what does the state really need? What does a connected Virginia look like? So these next slides, these are not activities of the collaborative. And I want to clarify that because we do have some agency members and they're not allowed to work on policy. So the efforts from here on out are efforts of members of the collaborative who can work on policy, like my organization. And there's some very exciting news in this arena. You know, this year, Wild Virginia helped to pass legislation in Virginia to help create what's called a Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. And what this plan would do is both identify and protect wildlife corridors all through the Commonwealth. And the bill actually requires the creation of a list of wildlife crossing projects and prioritize those, right? So the state needs to tell us where are the highest priority projects, where do they need to go, and what would they look like? And the bill also tasks VDOT with considering measures for the mitigation of harm caused to wildlife when they do highway design. So it's a big deal. It's a big step for our state. It's a whole new way of conceptualizing the landscape. And we hope to see that implemented to the fullest. But there's still some possibilities and still some things we can do. So I wanted to talk about those next. So this year, Wild Virginia helped to co-author a paper for the Virginia Conservation Network briefing book. And if you don't know about the briefing book, please check it out. It is such a great document. It goes through the environmental agenda that, you know, organizations like mine and other of our partners can all agree on across the state what should be the priorities this year in the General Assembly. And some of those things, of course, revolve around wildlife corridors because we're involved. But it's all about things that we still think need to be done in Virginia to improve habitat connectivity. And here's just a couple examples. So I just mentioned that the current bill that passed, you know, has to come up with this priority project list. And that's great. But that's just on paper. You know, we need to have next steps in policy to really fund those projects and get them on the ground. So that's what we're asking for this year. We also want to see that plan, that Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. You know, it's a beautiful map of the state and where the corridors are. We want to see that integrated right into other planning documents at the state level, county level, community level. So again, it's not just on paper, but it's in the planning. We also want to bring in private landowners. You know, over 80% of land in Virginia is in private hands. So we have to work with private landowners if we're really going to make an impact on what this state looks like and how connected it is. So what we're asking for this year is incentivize landowners to think about their land in this way, give them opportunities to participate. And then, of course, as Bridget mentioned, you know, we're really struggling with data. We don't have good data. So we're asking the state to help us get that data and standardize the way it's collected. And then the last three things we're asking for this year are all around the concept of aquatic connectivity. And that's something that we didn't talk about yet, but it's really important. You know, just like terrestrial species need to move, just the same for aquatic. So fish need to get where they need to go. Aquatic organisms need to move around, and there's lots of barriers to that movement. So for instance, under a road, you might see, you know, a blockage in a culvert. That means that those fish can't go where they need to go. So we're asking the state to standardize the way it looks at these barriers and then come up with a plan for removing those barriers as well. All right. And then most importantly, my judgy owl is wants you to know that you have a big role in all of this. So we're asking you to support state and federal bills that identify wildlife corridors. Please comment on upcoming VDOT projects and encourage them to really think about wildlife when they come up with a new plan. You know, think about high crash areas you know about. We're all out there driving around, so we see the areas that have high crashes, and make sure your decision makers know about that. Make sure VDOT knows about that. Let us know about that. And here's a great example. Bridget brought this to my attention. So salamander crossings here in Charlottesville are being funded by a developer, and that's happening because of community pressure. You know, the community identified an area that needed attention, they advocated for it, and they got results. So it works if we all work together. And then, you know, lastly, one of the best things we can all do when we walk out of here today is slow down when you're driving, especially this time of year when deer are really active. You know, I know we're not just talking about deer today, but they are very big, and when you hit them, you know it. So please slow down. It's one of the best things we can all do, especially at dawn and especially at dusk and especially in the fall. And encourage your friends and neighbors to do that as well, because we really can make a difference in the number of crashes that we're encountering. And then lastly, you can help by becoming a member of Wild Virginia. We're a totally membership organization, and we count on people like you to keep doing what we do. So please join us as a paid member, join our mailing list, and then we can keep you up to date on initiatives and ways you can support wildlife corridors in Virginia. And that's it. I wanted to be sure we had some times for questions, so I'm going to stop sharing. All right.
Well, great presentation. My goodness, I learned a ton, and hope you all did too. Anybody have any questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can write them in the chat, either way. Is that you, Sarah?
Yeah, but someone else had something to say as well, I think I heard.
Okay.
So I'm not the only one.
All right. Well, Sarah, it's a little hard hearing you, but we'll try you first, and then Anna would be next. So go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. Now, when Bridget gave her presentation, she told how the differences between before the fences and after the fences. I just want to make sure the culverts were the same size. Were the sizes of the culverts changed? What was changed about the culverts?
That's a good question. So nothing was changed about the culverts. We had the one big bridge underpass and then one large box culvert. And so those stayed the same. The only difference for that study was whether the fencing was there or not. So we did 2 years before fencing, 2 to 3 years after fencing. And that box culvert was 10 feet high and 12 feet wide, just for a little perspective. But yeah, we didn't change anything about the culverts themselves.
Okay, did you put different colors inside, different paths inside?
No, that's a good question. One thing you can do for wildlife to increase its attractiveness to them is, make sure that the floor is dirt. Like originally this box culvert was a concrete bottom, but over time it already had a lot of dirt and natural service for the animals. So we didn't have to change that. What I do want to change and plan to is to put some lighting in that box culvert because deer are very hesitant to go in there, and I can't blame them. You know, they're a prey species. It's very long and dark. And I think with some daytime kind of natural lighting during the day, that would increase the use even more. But I didn't want to make those changes during this study because I really wanted the only change to be fencing, because we just wanted to isolate the effects of the fencing for this study. That's a great question.
Thank you. And just a quick reminder, some folks are joining now. I think they thought it was at 3:30. Just to let everybody know, this is being videotaped, and we'll have the recording available on our YouTube website. So just email me if you need that. Okay. Just want to give another comment. Outstanding. So impressed by the VDOT study and the fence results. Great work. That's from Tom. And then Anna, are you next?
Yes. First of all, I want to echo what everybody else has said. This is, you all are doing a remarkable job. I really love the research and the control of the variables. So you didn't have too many things mixed up like the light. To make sure you could isolate the variables. So that was really terrific. I have 2 suggestions I'd like to make to you. I would, if you haven't already, contact someone at the Daily Progress, for example. The more press you guys can get about your projects and about what you're trying to accomplish and about how to join wildvirginia.org, the better. And also if you could contact somebody at a local station like NBC News and invite them maybe to come with you, right? to do some video like the one that you all have done, or maybe even use your video. But the more you get your message out there, I know there are thousands of people in Virginia that feel the same way I do, that have no idea that the work that you're doing, because they don't associate wildlife with VDOT, right? So those would be my suggestions. And maybe you've already done that already, but anyway, terrific job for both of you.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
So yeah, we have had some press on this quite a bit, but you know, even once a year, if it's in the news, it's so easy to miss. So I probably should reach out again to let them know. If you know Sandy Hausman from NPR, she recently did a story on it that I think played through most of Virginia. So it's gotten out there, but I think we do need to just reinforce it over and over again, because I'm still getting questions a lot about, you know, why are we spending money on this fencing and what is that fencing for? And some people don't love the way it looks. But once I tell them what it's for and how much of an impact it's had, they're glad to be there. You know, those are the sections on I-64 that you could drive on right now when all these deer are going crazy across roads and feel safe. Like, I live right off the Ivy exit. So every time I reach that fencing, I'm like, okay, I don't have to just constantly scan the sides of the road for deer, because I know that they're not going to be crossing here.
Sure.
So yeah, once people understand the message, it's been received very well. So thank you. And I'll continue trying to get that word out.
I think a lot of people in Charlottesville and Waynesboro and Stanton, where this is a huge issue, the more you all get this message out, the more support you get and the safer everybody will be.
True.
And actually, that's a good segue to Helena's chat, where she says we have a lot of crashes here in Fluvanna, and I heard about fencing corridors. Have you heard anything? So that's for Fluvanna.
Okay. No, so yeah, I have not looked into Fluvanna yet. But what I'm hoping that will come out of this study is I'm going to be kind of arming VDOT with the knowledge of how to find these problem areas. And I'm not sure if I mentioned on one of my last slides that one of the biggest things I'm proud of, the biggest change in VDOT from this is going to be that on their checklist for any new project, whether it's road maintenance or adding a lane or doing anything along a road, they have to consider wildlife vehicle collisions. So they have to do this assessment to determine whether it's a hot spot. And then if it is, it's going to link to those guidelines that I develop for how to mitigate in those areas. Because, you know, there's only one of me that really studies this in VDOT, so I can't go to all the places and figure it out. So the most efficient way is for them to be able to determine it themselves. And so that's going to be one change that's coming. And the other big one is we're going to be collecting better data on this stuff. Because like we said, police report data just doesn't cut it. So we're going to be arming the maintenance staff with an app on their cell phones where they can push a button every time they pick up a carcass. And that is going to increase our data set by at least 10 times. So we have things in the works, and maybe Fluvanna will be one of those areas.
Excellent. I see Helena saying thank you. Lori said, awesome that we have state legislation for wildlife corridors. I agree. Do other states have similar legislation? And also any prospect for national legislation?
Great question. I left that slide out because I was already way over time. But I did have a slide on the national corridor legislation. It's had a couple iterations now for a couple years, but basically what it would do if it gets through, and it does have large bipartisan support, would be to provide money for, you know, especially protecting wildlife corridors. And that's where we might be able to pull in that private land piece, you know, in a big way. And then it would also help, you know, identify and protect identify projects that are important and then get those projects on the ground. So for instance, if our state corridor bill comes up with a nice list of projects that they need funded and we get a federal bill passed that funds it, we've got a moment, right? So that's what we're hoping to see. It's really hard. I've been asking and no one's daring to make any predictions on Congress right now. But this issue is something that I have to say was fun to go to the General Assembly with last year. People were so happy to talk about wildlife corridors and something positive that everyone can get behind. So it's similar at the national level. You know, it's something that across the aisle people can come together around. And so I think it has a pretty good chance of, in some format, of getting through in the next year or two.
Brilliant, brilliant. From Lucy, this is a request for consumer education. Several of my neighbors and I have discussions discussing the question of what to do if and when we hit a deer or it hits us. We don't know the proper way to address our concerns and potential accidents. Any light shed on those?
Sure, I can take that one. That's a great question. So VDOT, and I should have it memorized, but I don't. If you just Google VDOT report a dead animal or report a road problem, the first link that comes up will be a link to that. You can either, on the link, there'll be a phone number or there'll be a short form asking where the animal is. So that's how VDOT learns about it so they can remove it. And they act quickly if an animal's in the road, because then it's a driver safety hazard. And let's see. So that's how, and you don't need to call the police unless you're really injured. Officially, if you think the damage is going to be more than $1,500, which is kind of every accident with a deer, you're supposed to report it to the police. But you know, you're probably not going to think of that if you're not injured and if you can drive your car away. So, so it's not like a total requirement to call the police. But as long as you let VDOT know where that animal is, they'll get it off the road. And if the animal is injured, unfortunately, which happens, the police will. You can call the police and they'll send somebody out to take care of it. I think they call the Wildlife Services Division or something, or Animal Control, I think is who does that.
Great. More questions coming in. You ready? Okay. This is to Misty from Sarah. Misty, you mentioned the salamander crossings. Do you have any feedback on whether the crossings have worked?
Yeah, the last I heard, and this was last year, they were absolutely using the crossings. I don't know that they've come out with a report on that, but I'm sure they will. But yeah, absolutely. Like they did a very good job of positioning them. And then again, it was a group of volunteers that cared about the site to begin with. So these folks, I think initially were already bucket brigading those salamanders across the road. So they knew when they were coming, they knew what was going on with them. And so they could actually see if they were using that crossing. But interestingly, similar to what Bridget's done at the large scale for deer, folks are examining doing that sort of thing for salamanders, you know, very small fences to make sure they use the crossing rather than the road. So that, I don't know if they've explored that at that site, but that would be really interesting to learn about.
Fascinating. Yeah, especially when the rain comes out, boy, you see them everywhere. Kathy Erskine, an author herself, says Crossings is a beautiful children's book on this topic that was just published last week. The author is Katie Duffield.
Ooh.
The book is called Crossings.
I gotta write that down.
Yeah, but it's in the chat.
How do we not know about that?
Well, it was just published last week. There,
Oh,
look,
okay.
All right, I'm gonna spotlight Kathy here. She's holding it up. Hold on, Kathy. There it is.
Wow. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
I feel like Wild Virginia needs to do a reading of a children's book. This is exciting. I love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. You want to unmute or you want to say anything more?
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. It's really gorgeous and very enlightening. And then it has more detail at the back for older kids or adults.
Oh, I'm going to get that for all of my nephews and nieces and kids for Christmas.
Beautiful.
Great Christmas
Thank
present.
you.
Great. Thanks, Kathy.
Sure.
Let's see. Cynthia, are there lab or field assistant programs for students interested in wildlife corridors? Are there lab or field assistant programs for students interested in wildlife corridors?
You take that one, Bridget, or do you want to take it?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things our collaborative has been doing over the last 2 months is kind of reimagining ourselves. We've attracted, like you say, so much attention and interest just by existing. We now have researchers on board that we didn't have before. The Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute has joined us. Universities have joined us. People are excited and want to help. And so we've actually created a group within our collaborative, and their whole job is to figure out what are the key research questions that we need to be getting after right now so that we can give those to students, right? And say, okay, these are the things we really need to know that would help us do a better job of protecting wildlife corridors in Virginia. So this is a great time to get involved with the collaborative if you are a researcher, or stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have some good ideas for you in the near future.
Awesome. Awesome. Is Crossings on Amazon? Kathy, can you answer that book? Yes,
It is. Yep.
it is. Okay. You know, we're doing Christmas shopping and holiday
Yeah,
shopping here as well.
absolutely.
So glad to know about that.
Yeah. Anybody else? I see some folks have unmuted themselves. Did you want to ask a question? Sarah, did you have a question, Sarah?
I'm good.
Okay.
I love this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Can I call on someone in the audience?
Oh, please.
All right, there's someone in this audience that I like a whole lot. David Hanna, I believe, is out there. And I believe that he was very involved in working on the Albemarle County Biodiversity Action Plan. I know that it talks a little bit about corridors. Am I putting you too much on the spot to just tell us what that means for Albemarle County?
And this is who, David?
David, he's under Lori. All right.
Oh,
now.
okay.
We can't hear you, David.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, well, thanks a lot for the shout out, Misty. I say that with tongue in cheek. But no, great to see you and Bridget. You guys are doing great work. Yeah, there's the Biodiversity Action Plan for Albemarle County that we finished maybe 2 years ago. And connectivity is one of the themes, large, unfragmented areas of habitat and connections between them. One of the major themes of the work. There's one site on Route 29 in the south part of the county near Colesville that is a possible target for some mitigation or some crossing work. I don't know that we have much data about animals there, but we know some mammals have died there over the years. So I think that the person who took my slot is talking to you guys about possibly working on that, or at least looking into that. So that would be great. So, and I love that you brought up aquatic crossings, because that I think is a big to do. We know that roads kill animals and animals hit our cars, and we sort of all know that. But fish and other aquatics, they are really hamstrung by culverts and road crossings and whatnot. So I love that you brought that up, and that can maybe be a future endeavor or something to kind of branch out and do. Our fish and mussels need a lot of help of all sorts. So I've forgotten what your original question was. I don't know if I touched on it or not, but
that was perfect. I just wanted people to know about that action plan. It's wonderful. And we have been talking to Kim Bastioli. Is that how you say her name? I apologize.
Yeah, Kim Biasioli.
Biasioli. I will get it straight. But yeah, she's really motivated and excited about seeing some real, getting some stuff done on the ground here in Albemarle. So if anybody's in the county, I think that's a really great place to plug in and get to know her and yeah, make sure she knows that you're supporting her in that.
And not just Kim, but talk to your elected officials if you live in the county too. Let them know you want to see conservation be a priority. And there are some things from the plan that are now in the county's comprehensive plan, which is sort of an official document which sets out policy for the county. So there's language about policy in the comprehensive plan that will allow the county to move forward with that if there's enough popular support. And I know there's not much money around these days. This is a difficult time, crazy year. So money is, in short supply right now, but in the future, that may not be an issue.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Sorry to put you on the spot. I appreciate it.
I expect that from you, Misty.
And I just got, Kathy, if you want to share what you just wrote in the chat, this is exciting.
Yes, the author of this book, Katie Duffield, was planning to come to this, but she lives in Arkansas, and I told her 3 o'clock, and of course she was thinking 3 her time, and it was 2 her time. So I'm glad you're recording this so that she can see it, but I think she's about to try hop on now and say hi. So maybe she can mention some of her research that she did.
That's exciting. Does she have the link?
I think I sent it to her. Maybe she's emailing me now to say, where's the link?
Okay. And while we're waiting, are there any other questions or comments? This has been amazing.
You hear me?
Oh, Katie Duffield, here she comes, right?
Yes.
Okay. Janice, yes, Janice, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Kathy Erskine. Charlottesville has a wonderful festival of the book. And that might be something that I think you might mention to Kathy Duffield. Now, obviously, this year has not been a year with COVID, but it's nice nationwide, and she could be very nice if she submitted her book to that, because they have a children's sections, they have all different venues.
That's right. Yeah, Saturday is like Children's Day or something. Yeah, that would be
So I might
super.
mention to her because they're always welcoming new books.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
So I hope this is okay with you ladies. We're not stealing your thunder here, bringing in this other
Oh,
woman.
that's great.
Okay, great. All right. Well, welcome Katie Duffield. And if you want to unmute yourself, we would love to hear from you about your book. We were talking about crossings. Well,
I have
go
one
ahead.
question about those beautiful grass overpasses like in Canada. Are we going to get any of those? Like on the eastern part of the States?
That would be amazing. But so those are multi-millions of dollars. They can be up to 10 million. So that's the biggest hurdle. And the fact is that in Virginia, we don't really have migratory species. You know, our deer don't necessarily travel in huge herds. And so those are usually used for elk and mule deer and other species that they don't want a driver to hit 20 of those at a time. And deer are also just as comfortable using underpasses, which are cheaper. Even a brand new underpass would be a lot cheaper than an overpass. So it's probably not likely, at least in the near future. But I'm hoping this whole concept of wildlife crossings in Virginia will like continue to pick up. And if there's enough momentum and like a fundraising effort, you know, it's possible because they're attractive too. I mean, it's just a really cool PR thing, if nothing else, but I'm sure
Exactly.
tons of animals would use it. So maybe someday.
Yeah, it would be great.
Yeah, and we found right through our research that, you know, while there's, you know, government funds that make those happen, it's a lot of private funds too. So the more people care about it and get excited about it, the more you attract those individual funds that are needed.
Right.
I
Good to
love
know.
it. It was actually the builder that did the salamander one. I didn't realize that. So that's cool.
We have one more question. Are projects planned specifically for our native brook trout passage in culverts?
I can speak to what I know about that. So there's been some pretty cool stuff going on with the Piedmont Environmental Council, and I hope I'm going to do them justice by talking about it here. Feel free to set me straight, anyone that knows more. But there's a lot of concern, first of all, across the state is that we don't know what the barriers are and what the scale of the problem is, because it just takes a long time to survey every culvert and see what's going on. And a lot of them are on private land too. But even once you know, it's expensive to put in a crossing that's, you know, really great for aquatic wildlife. And right now, VDOT's not really required to do that up to the scale that a lot of folks in the environmental community would like to see. And so a really cool partnership that's sort of developed between Piedmont Environmental Council and VDOT is, you know, VDOT will get a new crossing up to the level that they can with the money they have. And then Piedmont Environmental Council will leverage their private funds to take it up to the next level that really helps wildlife get where they need to go through that corridor. And so that's a model that could be, you know, extended throughout the state, certainly. And there's a lot of potential there. But, you know, first, it's a big question of what's there and what's missing and what are the barriers.
Fabulous. Great information there. Thank you. Well, gee whiz, I think we've really, thank you so much. All those questions and comments and suggestions for holiday gifts and, you know, we've touched on a lot of things. Thank you, ladies, so very much.
That's fun. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're so glad to talk about this. Thank you.
Anytime. And like I said, I will get the link posted. And if you are interested in seeing any of our videos, just Google the Center at Belvedere YouTube. And then you click on videos and all of the recordings that we have are there. So, all right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks,
Everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.